Did education in the Middle Ages really mean just dusty monks copying texts? Was it all about boring religious lectures and closed-off monasteries from 500 to 1500 CE? Or were there unsung heroes and quiet revolutions that changed how people learned forever? Number 1. The Carolingian Educational Revival and the Palatine School. When historians look back at the early medieval period, a period sometimes unfairly labeled the Dark Ages, a beacon of light often shines forth: the Carolingian Renaissance. At the heart of this intellectual resurgence, driven by Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish king, was a fundamental, often underestimated educational reform. This was not just about building schools, but about systematically reviving learning, standardizing texts, and elevating literacy across his vast empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Palatine School, Charlemagne's court school, served as the epicenter of this ambitious intellectual project. Charlemagne, despite perhaps not being fully literate himself in the modern sense, understood that a strong, unified empire required educated administrators, effective clergy, and a common intellectual culture. He recognized that the standard of Latin literacy had declined significantly across Europe, leading to difficulties in communication, administration, and even the correct understanding of Scripture. His reform efforts were a direct response to this perceived decline, aiming for a systematic intellectual uplift. The reform began with a series of decrees and capitularies, royal directives that mandated educational improvements. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 CE, for instance, called for the establishment of schools in every monastery and cathedral, urging bishops and abbots to teach grammar, singing, and computation for calendar purposes. This was a top-down mandate for widespread educational provision, a remarkable effort for its time. At the core of this revival was the Palatine School, Charlemagne's court school in Aachen. This was not a school for children in the modern sense, but a gathering of the best minds from across Europe, invited and patronized by Charlemagne himself. He assembled a diverse group of scholars: Alcuin of York from England, Peter of Pisa from Italy, Paul the deacon from Lombardy, and Theodulf of Orleans from Spain, among others. These scholars became the intellectual engine of the Carolingian Renaissance. Alcuin of York, an Anglo-Saxon scholar, was particularly instrumental. He became Charlemagne's chief educational advisor and the de facto head of the Palatine School. Alcuin oversaw a comprehensive reform of the curriculum, emphasizing the 7 liberal arts, trivium and quadrivium, which he saw as essential for a sound education. He stressed the importance of accurate texts and clear grammatical Latin. His influence extended far beyond the court, as he corresponded with scholars across the empire, setting intellectual standards. One of the most significant, yet often unappreciated aspects of this reform was the standardization of texts and script. In the preceding centuries, variations in script had made manuscripts difficult to read, and errors had crept into sacred and classical text during centuries of copying. Charlemagne launched a systematic effort to collect, correct, and disseminate authoritative versions of important texts, especially the Bible and liturgical books. Monasteries and cathedrals were tasked with producing accurate copies based on these corrected exemplars. This led to the widespread adoption of a new, highly legible script known as Carolingian minuscule. This clear, elegant script, with distinct upper and lower case letters, greatly improved readability and efficiency in copying. Its widespread use made books more accessible and reduced errors, becoming the direct ancestor of the typefaces we use today. This seemingly minor change in handwriting was a monumental step in the efficient transmission of knowledge, facilitating learning across the empire. The Carolingian reform also focused on the training of clergy. Charlemagne understood that a literate clergy was vital for the spiritual well-being of his subjects, and for the effective administration of the Church. He ensured that priests were taught to understand and preach Latin properly, and that they could accurately perform religious services. This improved the quality of pastoral care and solidified the Church's role as a moral and educational authority. The impact of this reform extended beyond the immediate reign of Charlemagne. The schools established during his time, particularly the monastic and cathedral schools, continued to flourish. The standardized texts and improved script spread throughout Europe, creating a common intellectual foundation. The emphasis on the liberal arts and the revival of classical learning laid the groundwork for the intellectual explosions of the High Middle Ages, including the rise of scholasticism and universities. While the Carolingian Renaissance did not create an entirely new system of public education, it dramatically raised the bar for literacy and intellectual pursuit within the existing ecclesiastical framework. It provided the corrected texts, the legible script, and the intellectual leadership that were desperately needed after centuries of decline. This systematic effort to revive, standardize, and disseminate learning was a quiet yet truly foundational educational reform, ensuring that the intellectual heritage of antiquity would survive and flourish for future generations. It was the spark that reignited the flame of European learning. Number 2. The monastic scriptorium and library system. When we imagine medieval education, the image of a quiet monk, hunched over a desk in a dimly lit scriptorium, meticulously copying a manuscript, often comes to mind. This image is not merely romantic. It points to one of the most fundamental and profoundly underrated educational reforms of the early and high medieval period: the monastic scriptorium and the systematic building of monastic libraries. This was not a reform of teaching methods or curriculum in the way universities later introduced. Instead, it was a quiet, disciplined revolution in the preservation, reproduction, and dissemination of written knowledge during an era when chaos threatened its very existence. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of the sophisticated literary, philosophical, and scientific knowledge of antiquity was at risk of being lost. Cities declined, established institutions crumbled, and widespread literacy outside the church dwindled. It was largely within the cloistered walls of monasteries that the flame of learning was kept alive, not through grand pronouncements, but through the patient, laborious act of copying. Monasteries, guided by rules like that of Saint Benedict, which emphasized a balance of prayer, manual labor, and sacred reading, Lectio Divina, became the primary centers for book production. The scriptorium, meaning a place for writing, was often a dedicated room or a section of the cloister where monks worked. This was a systematic effort, not just a casual pastime. Monks were assigned specific tasks. Some prepared parchment, others ruled lines. Some copied text, and still others illuminated initials or bound the finished books. It was an assembly line of sorts, albeit a very slow and human-powered one. The sheer volume of work undertaken by these scriptoria was immense. They copied not only liturgical texts and scripture, but also classical Latin authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Seneca. They preserved the works of early church fathers like Augustine and Jerome. They also copied scientific texts, legal codes, and historical chronicles. Without their ceaseless labor, countless ancient texts would have vanished into oblivion. This act of preservation was foundational. However, it was not just about copying. Monastic communities also built and maintained libraries. These were not public libraries in the modern sense, but carefully curated collections of the books produced in their own scriptoria or acquired through exchange with other monasteries. The library was seen as essential for study and prayer. The very act of collecting, cataloging, and preserving these books was a silent but powerful educational reform. It established a tradition of intellectual stewardship and a commitment to maintaining a repository of knowledge. The monastic focus on accurate copying, while prone to human error, instilled a discipline of textual fidelity. Scribes were trained to copy with precision, recognizing that their work was vital for the integrity of the texts. This commitment to accurate transmission was a form of intellectual quality control. Furthermore, monastic scholars often served as editors, comparing different versions of a text to create a more authoritative copy. This early form of textual criticism was crucial for preserving the purity of ancient works. The reform also lay in the standardized production methods and the spread of certain scripts. The development of legible standardized bookhands, like Carolingian minuscule, which originated in monastic scriptoria, greatly improved the readability of texts. This standardization made it easier for scholars to read manuscripts produced in different regions, facilitating the wider circulation of knowledge. Moreover, the monastic system also fostered a network of intellectual exchange. Monasteries would lend books to one another for copying, creating a web of shared knowledge. Important texts copied in one scriptorium could eventually find their way to another, gradually spreading learning across regions. This silent network was a key mechanism for disseminating knowledge in a pre-printing press era. The impact of this monastic enterprise cannot be overstated. It ensured the survival of the intellectual heritage of the ancient world, provided the basic texts that would later be studied and debated in cathedral schools and universities. Painstaking labor of thousands of unnamed monks laid the intellectual groundwork for every subsequent educational development in Western Europe. While often seen as a passive act of preservation, the systematic creation and maintenance of scriptoria and libraries was a proactive, disciplined, and utterly essential educational reform that kept the flame of learning alive and made future intellectual flourishing possible. It was the bedrock upon which all later medieval education was built. Number 3. The Toledo School of Translators. When people discuss the intellectual awakening of medieval Europe, they often speak of the rediscovery of Aristotle or the flourishing of scholasticism. What is frequently glossed over, however, is the mechanism through which much of this crucial knowledge re-entered Western Europe: the systematic and immense effort of the Toledo School of Translators. This was not a formal school in the modern sense, but a concentrated, collaborative effort of scholars in the city of Toledo, Spain, during the 12th and 13th centuries. It was a monumental, often quiet, intellectual reform that funneled vast amounts of previously lost or unknown knowledge into the Latin West, radically transforming its intellectual landscape. Toledo, after its reconquest by Christian forces in 1085, became a unique cultural crossroads. For centuries, it had been a vibrant intellectual center under Muslim rule, where Arabic scholars had preserved, translated, and built upon the scientific and philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, Persia, and India. When the Christians took control, they inherited not just a city, but a treasure trove of manuscripts written in Arabic, covering subjects from philosophy and medicine to mathematics and astronomy. These texts held knowledge that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. The Toledo School was not an organized institution with a headmaster and curriculum. Instead, it was an informal, yet highly effective network of scholars drawn to Toledo from across Europe. These individuals, often driven by personal intellectual curiosity or patronage from enlightened churchmen like Archbishop Raymond of Toledo, undertook the arduous task of translating these Arabic texts into Latin. The language of Western scholarship, process of translation was often collaborative and complex. It usually involved a Jewish scholar who was fluent in Arabic and Castilian, the local vernacular, translating the Arabic text verbally into Castilian. Then, a Latin scholar who understood Castilian and was proficient in Latin would translate the Castilian into Latin. This two-step process while painstaking allowed for a relatively accurate transfer of meaning across linguistic and cultural divides. Figures like Gerard of Cremona, who translated over 80 books, and Michael Scott, known for his translations of Avicenna and Averroes, became giants in this endeavor. The sheer volume and breadth of the translated works were astonishing. The Toledo translators made available to the Latin West a vast array of scientific and philosophical knowledge that had been preserved and advanced by Islamic scholars. This included Greek philosophy, translations of almost all of Aristotle's works that were unknown in the West, along with commentaries by influential Islamic philosophers like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Averroes, Ibn Rushd. These texts revolutionized Western philosophical thought and laid the groundwork for scholasticism. Medicine. Key medical texts like Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, which became a standard medical textbook in European universities for centuries. Also, works by Rhazes and other Arabic physicians. Mathematics, Arabic numerals, algebra, from Al-Khwarizmi, and advanced geometry, which transformed calculations and engineering. Astronomy. Sophisticated astronomical tables, instruments, and theories from Islamic astronomers, including Ptolemy's Almagest, previously only available in partial corrupted Latin versions. These were crucial for navigation, timekeeping, and understanding the cosmos. Alchemy and optics, texts on experimental sciences, laying groundwork for future scientific inquiry. The impact of these translations was immediate and profound. They fundamentally changed the intellectual curriculum of the nascent European universities. Professors and students suddenly had access to a wealth of new information and sophisticated intellectual tools. Aristotle's logic and metaphysics provided a new framework for theological and philosophical debate. Arabic medical texts advanced anatomical and clinical knowledge. Astronomical tables enabled more accurate predictions and navigation. This influx of knowledge was a quiet explosion. It sparked intense intellectual ferment, debates, and controversies as scholars struggled to integrate this new pagan and Islamic learning with Christian doctrine. It fuels the rise of scholasticism, which was precisely the method developed to synthesize these disparate knowledge traditions. Without the Toledo School, much of the intellectual dynamism of the High Middle Ages, including the work of figures like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, would have been impossible. The Toledo School was not about creating new knowledge, but about recovering and transmitting existing knowledge on an unprecedented scale. It was a massive collective intellectual undertaking that went largely unheralded in its time. Yet its repercussions rippled through every aspect of medieval intellectual life. It was a fundamental educational reform, the unsung hero of knowledge transfer that quite literally opened up a new world of understanding for medieval Europe. Number 4. The emergence of cathedral schools as urban centers of learning. While undeniably crucial, these institutions were largely insular, serving primarily to train future clergy for life within the monastery. However, as the High Middle Ages dawned, a significant, often overlooked educational reform began to take shape: the emergence and proliferation of cathedral schools. These urban centers of learning, tied to the bishop's seat, became crucial precursors to the universities, transforming the educational landscape by bringing learning closer to the people and expanding its scope. Cathedral schools had existed in rudimentary forms earlier, providing basic education for future priests within the cathedral's diocese. But from the 11th century onwards, their role expanded dramatically. They became vibrant intellectual hubs, no longer solely focused on internal clerical training. This transformation was driven by several factors: the growing need for educated administrators for an increasingly complex church and nascent secular governments, the revival of trade and urban life, and a renewed intellectual curiosity. Bishops, as leaders of their dioceses, often actively promoted education. They saw the value in having well-educated clergy who could administer sacraments, preach effectively, and manage the growing administrative burdens of their sees. They also needed skilled individuals to manage their extensive landholdings and legal affairs. This practical need fueled the growth and professionalization of teaching within cathedral schools. Unlike monastic schools, which were typically rural and designed for life within a monastic order, cathedral schools were inherently urban. They were located in bustling cities which were becoming centers of commerce, politics, and intellectual exchange. This urban setting meant they were more accessible to a wider range of students, not just those destined for monastic life. Boys from prosperous merchant families, urban artisans, and members of the burgeoning gentry could attend, seeking an education that would equip them for careers in the church, law, medicine, or administration. Curriculum of cathedral schools also began to broaden beyond purely theological or liturgical studies, while the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic remained central, preparing students for effective communication and argumentation. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music also gained prominence. Moreover, some cathedral schools began to offer specialized instruction in subjects like law and medicine, reflecting the practical needs of urban society. For instance, the cathedral school at Chartres, under the master Fulbert and later John of Salisbury, became renowned for its focus on classical literature and philosophy, attracting students from across Europe. A key aspect of this reform was the development of masters and students as distinct, often itinerant, groups. Talented masters, sometimes known as magistri, would attract students who followed them from one cathedral school to another. This mobility of teachers and learners fostered a vibrant intellectual environment, allowing ideas and teaching methods to spread. It also meant that the reputation of a cathedral school grew based on the quality of its masters, leading to a healthy competition for academic excellence. Cathedral schools also played a vital role in the recovery and dissemination of classical learning. As old texts were rediscovered and translated, masters in these schools eagerly incorporated them into their teaching. They debated ancient philosophies, analyzed classical literature, and applied ancient logical methods to contemporary problems. This intellectual engagement was critical for the intellectual ferment that characterized the 12th century, sometimes called the Renaissance of the 12th century. The very structure of teaching within cathedral schools became more formalized. Lectures, disputations, formal debates, and the use of textbooks became common practices. Masters would lecture on authoritative texts, students would copy notes, and then engage in debates to solidify their understanding. This pedagogical approach, while evolving, laid the groundwork for the more structured university system that would emerge later. The impact of cathedral schools was profound. They provided a higher level of education than previously available to many outside the monastery. They produced generations of educated individuals who filled important roles in society, from bishops and royal clerks to lawyers and physicians. They fostered intellectual innovation and debate, acting as incubators for new ideas and methodology. Perhaps most importantly, they served as the direct intellectual ancestors of the great medieval universities. Many of the first universities, such as the University of Paris, grew directly out of the thriving cathedral schools of their respective cities, absorbing their masters, students, and intellectual traditions. This often uncelebrated shift from monastic learning to vibrant urban cathedral schools was a pivotal reform. It democratized access to advanced learning, diversified the curriculum, and fostered a mobile intellectual community. These schools were the bridge that connected isolated monastic scholarship to the dynamic open academic world of the university, making them a truly understated yet foundational chapter in the history of education. Number 5. The scholastic method. Many people hear scholasticism and picture dry, endless debates about abstract concepts. Perhaps even, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? This common misperception hides one of the most profoundly influential and underrated educational reforms of the medieval period: the development and widespread adoption of the scholastic method itself. This was not a curriculum, a school, or an invention, but a systematic, rigorous, intellectual approach to learning and inquiry that transformed how knowledge was organized, debated, and understood across medieval Europe. It was a methodology that empowered critical thinking within a structured framework. The scholastic method emerged primarily in the burgeoning universities of the 12th and 13th centuries, notably at the University of Paris. It was a response to the growing influx of new philosophical and theological texts, especially the rediscovered works of Aristotle, which challenged existing Christian doctrine. Scholars needed a way to reconcile these new, often contradictory sources of knowledge with established truths and to resolve apparent conflicts. At its core, the scholastic method was about structured inquiry and dialectical reasoning. It involved a specific process for investigating questions, analyzing different viewpoints, and attempting to arrive at a reasoned conclusion. This method was not about blindly accepting authority, but about engaging with it critically and systematically. It was a rigorous intellectual exercise designed to clarify complex issues. The standard procedure for a scholastic inquiry typically followed a pattern that might look familiar to modern researchers. First, a specific question was posed. This question was often controversial or involved conflicting authorities. For example, is it permissible for a Christian to engage in usury, lending money with interest? Second, arguments for the affirmative side of the question were presented. These arguments would be drawn from authoritative texts, scripture, church fathers, classical philosophers like Aristotle, or legal codes. The scholastics were masters of quoting and interpreting authoritative sources. Third, arguments against the affirmative side were presented, again drawing from a range of authoritative sources. Goal was to present the strongest possible arguments for both sides of the issue, exploring the full complexity of the problem. This phase often involved identifying apparent contradictions between different authorities, or between reason and revelation. Fourth, the master or scholar would then provide their own solution or determinatio to the question. This was the core of the scholastic contribution. The solution was not simply a statement of personal opinion. It involved a careful analysis of the arguments presented, distinguishing between different meanings of terms, clarifying ambiguities, and often reinterpreting or productizing authorities to resolve the apparent contradictions. The master used logical reasoning to build a coherent argument that addressed all the previous points. Finally, the master would go back and systematically respond to each of the initial arguments, explaining why some were flawed, why others were only partially true, or how they could be reinterpreted to fit the overall solution. This final step demonstrated the thoroughness of the inquiry, showing that all objections had been considered and addressed. This method was applied not just to theological questions, but to law, medicine, and philosophy. It was a systematic way to engage with complex problems, demanding precision in language, clarity in argumentation, and a deep understanding of authoritative sources. Students learned to think critically by participating in this process, either by listening to masters lecture through these problems or by engaging in formal disputations, debates themselves. The reform was profound because it fostered a culture of intellectual rigor. It moved medieval learning beyond mere rote memorization or simple commentary. It instilled a habit of critical analysis and logical coherence. While some might criticize its formalistic nature, it developed highly sophisticated analytical tools that enabled scholars to wrestle with incredibly complex questions, reconciling faith and reason, ancient wisdom and new discoveries. For example, Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar, famously applied this method in his Summa Theologica. He systematically addressed thousands of theological and philosophical questions, laying out objections, counter-objections, and his reasoned solutions which became foundational to Western thought. This structured approach allowed for the comprehensive organization of vast bodies of knowledge and the resolution of countless intellectual dilemmas. The scholastic method taught students how to identify a problem, gather relevant information, evaluate different perspectives, construct a logical argument, and defend their conclusions. These are skills that are timeless and fundamental to any advanced learning. Transformed medieval universities into dynamic arenas of intellectual debate where ideas were tested and refined through rigorous, systematic inquiry. The method itself, more than the specific conclusions it reached, was the truly revolutionary and often unappreciated educational reform. It taught the medieval world how to think. Number 6. The professionalization of copying and book production. When we think of medieval books, the image of a monk in a scriptoria meticulously copying manuscripts often comes to mind. While monastic scribes certainly played a crucial role in preserving knowledge, a profound, often overlooked educational reform took place as the medieval period progressed: the professionalization and commercialization of book production. This shift moved book creation beyond the cloistered walls of monasteries, transforming it into a lay industry that significantly increased the availability of texts, impacting learning in ways that prepared the ground for even greater changes. In the early Middle Ages, most books were indeed produced in monastic scriptoria. These institutions were vital for preserving classical and early Christian texts during a period of relative decline in literacy outside the church. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, often for their own libraries or for other monasteries. This was a slow, labor-intensive process, and books were incredibly rare and expensive, limiting access to a very select few. Each book was a unique hand-crafted back. However, by the 12th and 13th centuries, a new demand for books emerged, driven by the rise of universities and the growing intellectual curiosity of a more literate urban population. Universities, with their increasing numbers of students and professors, needed multiple copies of standard texts for study. Monastic scriptoria, designed for internal use, simply could not keep up with this burgeoning demand. This created a vacuum that was filled by professional scribes, stationers, and eventually early proto-printing shops. The emergence of the Picia system in universities like Paris and Bologna was a crucial innovation. Instead of copying an entire book, a master copy of a text was divided into small sections called picia or pieces. These picia were then loaned out to professional scribes for copying. Each scribe would copy one or more picia, which could then be assembled to create a complete book. This system dramatically sped up the copying process and decentralized it. A stationer, licensed by the university, managed the picia, ensuring accuracy and setting the price for copying. This commercialization meant texts could be produced more quickly and in larger numbers, albeit still by hand. These professional scribes and stationers were often lay individuals, sometimes organized into guilds, who made their living from producing books. Their workshops were distinct from monastic scriptoria. They focused on efficiency and meeting market demand. This professional environment led to innovations in materials and techniques. For instance, the increasing availability and use of paper, which began to trickle into Europe from the Islamic world in the 12th century, provided a cheaper alternative to expensive parchment made from animal skins. While still a luxury item, paper significantly reduced the cost of producing a book compared to earlier centuries. Contents of these professionally produced books also diversified. While theological and philosophical texts for universities remained a staple, there was a growing demand for legal texts, medical treatises, vernacular literature, and even practical handbooks. This reflected a broader base of literacy and intellectual interest among merchants, lawyers, doctors, and the urban gentry who could afford books. The existence of a commercial book trade meant that individuals could acquire books for personal study or leisure rather than relying solely on institutional libraries. The shift also saw the development of more standardized formats and scripts. Professional scribes often adopted more compact and efficient scripts, like Gothic textura, to save space and parchment, making books more economical. The meticulous ornamentation of earlier monastic manuscripts often gave way to more functional layouts, though beautiful illuminated manuscripts still existed for wealthy patrons. The focus shifted from artistic embellishment to efficient transmission of text. Moreover, the commercial nature of book production meant that copyists were under pressure to be accurate and efficient. While errors certainly occurred, the system of picia and the oversight of stationers often aimed for fidelity to the master text. This improved textual reliability, which was vital for scholarly work. The ability to compare multiple copies of a text also aided scholars in creating more authoritative editions. Professionalization of book production also fostered the growth of bookselling and book markets. Cities with universities, like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, became centers of the book trade. Booksellers acted as intermediaries, commissioning copies, buying and selling manuscripts, and connecting scribes with customers. This infrastructure made it easier for scholars and students to acquire the texts they needed, fueling the academic growth of the High Middle Ages. This slow but steady transformation of book production, from a monastic endeavor to a professional commercial enterprise, was a quietly revolutionary educational reform. It chipped away at the scarcity and exclusivity of written knowledge, made books more numerous, less expensive, relatively speaking, and more accessible to a wider segment of society, laying vital groundwork for the intellectual explosions of the Renaissance and Reformation. Without this unsung development in the world of texts, the later impact of the printing press would have been far less profound, as the mechanisms for commercial book production and distribution were already being established. Number 7. The guild system's structured apprenticeship and practical training. When we think of medieval education, our minds often jump to universities, monastic schools, or learned scholars poring over Latin texts. This image, while accurate for a certain segment of society, entirely misses a colossal parallel educational system that shaped the lives of most people and kept medieval society functioning. The guild system's structured apprenticeship and practical training. This was an educational reform that operated outside the academic walls. Yet it was vital for the transmission of practical skills, knowledge, and ethical conduct, making it profoundly influential and often underestimated. During the High and Late Middle Ages, as towns and cities grew, so did specialized trades. Craftspeople, artisans, and merchants organized themselves into guilds. These were not just social clubs. They were powerful, professional organizations that regulated their respective crafts. A primary function of these guilds was education and quality control. They ensured that skills were passed down effectively and that high standards were maintained for the goods and services produced. This systematic approach to vocational training was an educational reform in itself. The core of this system was the apprenticeship. A young person, typically a boy but sometimes a girl in certain trades like textile work, would enter into a formal contract with a master craftsman. This contract, often legally binding and witnessed by officials, usually lasted for several years, typically 7 years, though it could vary depending on the complexity of the craft. During this period, the apprentice lived with the master's family, becoming part of the household. This immersive environment ensured that learning was constant, blending work with daily life. The education provided by the master was holistic. It was not just about physical skills. The master was obligated to teach the apprentice all the secrets of the trade, from the basic techniques to the more advanced intricacies, including how to source materials, manage a workshop, and deal with customers. Apprentices learned by observing, imitating, and then gradually participating in the actual work. For a carpenter, this meant learning to select wood, use tools, understand joinery, and construct furniture. For a weaver, it involved operating the loom, dyeing threads, and understanding different patterns. Beyond the specific craft skills, the apprenticeship also instilled discipline, work ethic, and moral conduct. Apprentices learned patience, perseverance, and the importance of precision. They were taught punctuality, respect for the master, and the value of honest labor. The master acted as a surrogate parent, responsible for the apprentice's moral and spiritual welfare. This ethical component was a significant part of the training, preparing the apprentice not just for a trade, but for responsible citizenship within the community. After completing the apprenticeship, the individual became a journeyman. The word journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day, indicating that they were now paid for their daily work. Journeymen traveled, working for various masters in different towns, gaining broader experience and refining their skills. This period of travel was crucial for exposure to different techniques, styles, and markets, provided a form of continuing education, allowing them to deepen their expertise before potentially setting up their own workshop. This mobile learning was a unique aspect of the guild system. To become a master craftsman, a journeyman had to present a masterpiece to the guild. This was a complex, high-quality piece of work that demonstrated their complete mastery of the craft. For a tailor, it might be a perfectly cut and sewn garment. For a goldsmith, an intricately designed piece of jewelry. The masterpiece was rigorously judged by existing masters in the guild. If it passed, the journeyman was admitted into the guild as a master, gaining the right to open their own workshop, take on apprentices, and sell their goods. This system ensured that only the most skilled and experienced individuals attained master status, maintaining the quality and reputation of the craft. The guild system also had an educational role beyond individual training. Guilds often maintained common standards for materials, tools, and production methods. They might organize collective workshops or demonstrations, sharing best practices among masters. They also served as a repository of collective knowledge, preserving and transmitting the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftsmen. This collective knowledge was often codified in guild statutes and traditions, forming an unwritten curriculum for the entire trade. This comprehensive system of vocational education was critical for medieval society. It produced the skilled labor force necessary to build cathedrals, create beautiful art, manage trade, and provide essential services. It was a decentralized, practical form of learning that was often more accessible than formal schooling, as it did not require literacy in Latin. It provided a direct pathway to a livelihood and social standing for countless individuals. The guild system was a silent giant of medieval educational reform, shaping the practical skills and economic landscape of an entire era. Its structure and systematic approach to skill transmission often overlooked in favor of academic pursuits. Number 8. The liberal arts curriculum, trivium and quadrivium, as a foundational system. When we talk about medieval education, it is easy to focus on impressive Gothic cathedrals or the vibrant university towns. Yet, beneath the grand structures and intellectual debates, lay a quiet foundational reform that shaped the very way people thought and learned for centuries. The systematization of the liberal arts curriculum into the trivium and quadrivium. This structure, often just a list of subjects in historical texts, was a profound intellectual blueprint, establishing a common framework for education across the Latin West. It was not a building or new type of institution, but a conceptual reform that ordered knowledge and prepared minds for deeper study. The concept of the 7 liberal arts had ancient roots, stretching back to Greek and Roman thought. However, it was in the early medieval period, particularly during the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries, that this grouping of subjects became formalized and universally adopted as the core curriculum. This standardization was a deliberate effort to rescue and organize the remnants of classical learning after the decline of the Roman Empire, providing a pathway to intellectual rigor for a new era. The liberal arts were divided into two main categories: the trivium and the quadrivium. Trivium meaning the three ways, focused on the arts of language. It consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, often referred to as the arts of words. The quadrivium, meaning the four ways, concentrated on the arts of number and measurement. It included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the arts of things. These two groups were seen as sequential and complementary, building a comprehensive intellectual foundation. Grammar was the first subject within the trivium. It was not just about correct spelling or punctuation. Medieval grammar was a broad discipline that included the study of Latin language, literature, and even basic interpretation of texts. Students learned to read, write, and understand the nuances of classical Latin authors like Virgil and Cicero. This mastery of language was considered the absolute prerequisite for all further learning, providing the tools for clear expression and comprehension. It trained the mind to analyze sentences, understand syntax, and grasp the meaning of complex passages. Rhetoric, the second part of the trivium, focused on the art of persuasive communication. It taught students how to construct effective arguments, deliver speeches, and write compelling prose. This involved understanding figures of speech, argument, structure, and the art of persuasion. While it seems like a specialized skill, rhetoric was seen as essential for legal professionals, theologians, and administrators, allowing them to present ideas clearly and convincingly. It trained individuals to articulate their thoughts with precision and impact. Logic, or dialectic, was the third and arguably most crucial component of the trivium. This discipline taught the rules of reasoning, valid argumentation, and critical thinking. Students learned to identify fallacies, construct syllogisms, and engage in systematic debate. Logic was the intellectual engine of scholasticism, the dominant mode of inquiry in later medieval universities. It trained students to analyze problems, construct coherent arguments, and defend their positions, forming the very backbone of intellectual discourse. Once a student mastered the trivium, they were deemed ready to proceed to the quadrivium. Arithmetic was not just rote counting. It involved the study of numbers and their properties, often derived from classical sources like Boethius. It laid the abstract mathematical groundwork for the other sciences. Geometry involved the study of shapes, sizes, and relative positions, drawing on Euclid's elements. It was fundamental for understanding the physical world and was applied in architecture and land measurement. Astronomy was a practical science, crucial for understanding the calendar, determining religious feast days, and later for navigation. It involved the study of the movements of celestial bodies. Music, specifically the theory of music, explored the mathematical relationships between sounds and harmonies. It was often viewed as a branch of mathematics, revealing the underlying order and proportion in the universe, rather than just an art form. The reform lay in the widespread adoption and consistent application of the structured curriculum. From monastic schools to cathedral schools and later the nascent universities, the trivium and quadrivium provided a universal framework. A student who had completed the liberal arts in one part of Europe would have a similar intellectual foundation to a student in another, facilitating the movement of scholars and ideas across the continent. This common intellectual language was instrumental in the intellectual flourishing of the High Middle Ages. The liberal arts were not considered an end in themselves, but rather a preparation, a gateway to higher studies. Mastery of the trivium made students ready for philosophical and theological debates, Quadrivium provided the quantitative skills necessary for advanced work in medicine, law, or theology, particularly in understanding cosmic order or the application of principles. This sequential learning, moving from language to reason to number, built minds systematically. This foundational reform provided intellectual discipline. It taught students not just what to think, but how to think. It emphasized analytical skills, clear communication, and logical reasoning, skills that remain fundamental to education today. While often presented simply as a list of subjects, the widespread and systematic implementation of the trivium and quadrivium created a unified educational ladder, silently empowering generations of medieval scholars, administrators, and thinkers. It was a curriculum that shaped intellectual habits and pathways, making it a truly underrated, yet profoundly influential, medieval educational reform. Number 9. The mendicant orders initiation into university life. When people picture medieval universities, they often imagine secular masters teaching eager students, or perhaps powerful bishops overseeing the curriculum. What is frequently overlooked, however, is the dynamic and often disruptive force introduced by the mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These orders, established in the early 13th century, were founded on principles of poverty, preaching, and service to the urban poor. Yet within decades of their inception, they became integral and sometimes controversial parts of the burgeoning university system across Europe, transforming the intellectual landscape from within. The traditional monastic orders were typically enclosed, focused on contemplative life and manual labor within their monasteries. Learning for them was often a means to understand Scripture and to serve God in isolation. The mendicants, in stark contrast, were itinerant preachers. Their mission demanded a deep understanding of theology and philosophy to engage with heresy and instruct a growing urban populations. This immediate need for educated members drove them directly to the intellectual hubs of the time, the universities. The Dominicans, also known as the Order of Preachers, were particularly keen on intellectual pursuits. Their founder, St. Dominic, emphasized that his friars needed to be well-versed in scholastic theology to effectively combat the Albigensian heresy in southern France. This commitment to intellectual rigor led them to establish schools within their convents and very quickly to send their most promising members to study at and eventually teach in the major universities like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. They saw the university as a vital training ground for their mission. The Franciscans, initially more focused on humble service and evangelical poverty under St. Francis of Assisi, also recognized the necessity of intellectual preparation for their mission of preaching and ministering to the urban population. While Francis himself was cautious of excessive intellectualism, his followers, particularly figures like Anthony of Padua and Bonaventure, soon saw the value of rigorous study. They too established studia generalia, or houses of study, which often became associated with universities, allowing their friars to pursue degrees and engage in academic debate. The arrival of these mendicant masters and students in universities was not always smooth. They often challenged the established secular masters. Mendicant friars lived communally, often under vows of poverty, and their commitment to study was absolute, as it was directly tied to their religious mission. This contrasted with the often more pragmatic concerns of secular masters who relied on student fees and benefices. The mendicants' dedication and often their superior scholarship quickly earned them teaching chairs and influential positions. One of the most famous examples of their impact can be seen at the University of Paris, the premier theological center of Europe. The Dominicans established their College of Saint Jacques, and the Franciscans their Convent of the Cordeliers, both attracting large numbers of students. Renowned figures like Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican, and Bonaventure, a Franciscan, became professors at Paris. Their presence brought new vigor to scholastic theology, integrating Aristotelian philosophy into Christian thought in unprecedented ways. Aquinas, for instance, in his Summa Theologica, provided a comprehensive synthesis of Christian doctrine and Aristotelian reason, becoming a cornerstone of Catholic theology. This integration of new philosophical ideas, often from translated Arabic texts, was championed by the mendicants. The mendicants also pushed for intellectual boundaries. They were often at the forefront of adopting and interpreting newly available works of Aristotle, which had been rediscovered and translated from Arabic and Greek. This embrace of Aristotelian philosophy, often met with suspicion by some secular masters who feared its potential for heresy, was vigorously pursued by mendicant scholars. They believed that reason properly understood could support faith, not undermine it. This intellectual courage and openness to new ideas profoundly shaped the curriculum and debates within universities, particularly in the faculties of theology and arts. Furthermore, the mendicant order's presence democratized higher education in a subtle way. While university enrollment was still limited, the mendicant houses often provided a pathway for men from more humble backgrounds to receive a high-level education. If a young man joined an order, his education was often supported by the order itself, making advanced learning accessible without the need for personal wealth. This opened up the intellectual sphere to a broader segment of society, albeit within the confines of religious life. The mendicant friars were not just scholars, they were also active preachers. Their academic training was directly applied to their mission of communicating complex theological truths to lay audiences in plain language. This practical application of scholarship gave their academic pursuits a dynamism that perhaps secular masters sometimes lacked. Their sermons, often delivered in the vernacular, were informed by the rigorous intellectual training they received in universities, bridging the gap between abstract academic theory and popular religious understanding. Franciscan scholars like Roger Bacon at Oxford pursued experimental science and optics, demonstrating a broader intellectual curiosity fostered within these orders. While Bacon's work was often controversial, it showed the intellectual vitality and diverse interests that flourished under the mendicant umbrella within university settings. Their presence enriched the intellectual life of the universities, bringing new questions, new methods, and new energies to the forefront of academic discourse. Ultimately, the mendicant orders transformed medieval universities from institutions primarily training clergy and lawyers into vibrant centers of theological and philosophical debate, open to new ideas and methods. Their intellectual dynamism and their commitment to rigorous study helped define the character of scholasticism and influence the intellectual trajectory of Europe for centuries. Their integration into university life was a profound, often understated reform that injected new life and purpose into medieval higher education, cementing the role of universities as crucibles of intellectual progress. Number 10. The slow but significant shifted towards vernacular literacy and education. This reform is often overshadowed by the grand narrative of Latin's dominance throughout the medieval period. Many people picture a world where all learning happened in a language only scholars and clergy understood. While Latin certainly held immense power and prestige as the language of the church, law, and high scholarship, a quiet, gradual shift was happening beneath the surface. This change began to crack open the exclusive world of Latin learning, making knowledge just a tiny bit more accessible to a wider group of people, even if it was a very slow crack. During the early and high Middle Ages, Latin was undeniably the language of the educated elite across Western Europe. Scholars wrote in Latin, Mass was conducted in Latin, and legal documents were often drafted in Latin. This created a significant barrier for the majority of the population, who spoke various regional dialects and nascent national languages, which we now recognize as early forms of English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. Yet, as the medieval period progressed, certain needs and developments began to chip away at Latin's sole supremacy in educational contexts. One key driver for this shift was the growing complexity of commerce and governance in urban centers. As towns grew and trade routes expanded, merchants and administrators needed to communicate more effectively with one another, often across linguistic divides. While Latin offered a common tongue, practical needs sometimes pushed for the use of local languages in record-keeping, commercial contracts, and even some forms of local governance. This led to the emergence of scribes and notaries who, alongside their Latin skills, also possessed proficiency in the vernacular, enabling them to draft documents that could be understood by common folk involved in these transactions. Another important factor was the rise of new literary forms. Epic, poems, romances, and chronicles began to be composed, not just in Latin, but in the evolving vernaculars. Works like the French Song of Roland, the German Nibelungenlied, or the English Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer became popular, showing the power and beauty of language beyond the confines of Latin. These texts were often read aloud, captivating audiences who had no formal Latin education. Scribes began to copy these vernacular works with increasing frequency, and while they were primarily for entertainment, they subtly fostered a literacy that was distinct from scholarly Latin. People learned to read and write in their own tongue, even if it was initially for stories or practical purposes. Furthermore, religious instruction, especially among lay populations, saw a subtle shift. While the Mass remained in Latin, preachers often delivered sermons in the vernacular to ensure their message reached the congregation. Manuals for prayer, devotion, and even simple catechisms began to appear in local languages. These texts were essential for religious instruction outside of formal monastic or cathedral schools, allowing lay individuals to engage with their faith on a more personal, understandable level. This vernacular religious literature, though not formal schooling, indirectly contributed to a broader, albeit basic, literacy among the general populace. The invention of paper, which slowly became more available and cheaper than parchment during the late medieval period, also played a quiet but significant role. This new material made it more feasible to produce more copies of texts, including those in the vernacular. While still a labor-intensive process of hand-copying paper reduced the cost per book, making them slightly more attainable for a wider range of individuals, including prosperous merchants and gentry who might prefer books in their native tongue. This increased availability of vernacular texts, from romances to practical guides, gently nudged the educational landscape towards a more inclusive model. Moreover, certain specialized fields began to produce texts in the vernacular. For instance, treatises on falconry hunting or practical medicine, intended for a lay audience of nobles or practitioners, were increasingly written in regional languages. These texts were designed for direct application and understanding without the need for a Latin intermediary. Medical practitioners, for example, might learn from texts in Latin, but increasingly consulted and created works in vernacular languages for their patients or for practical notes. This practical application of vernacular writing demonstrated its utility and importance beyond mere storytelling or religious instruction. Development of vernacular literacy was also fostered by the emergence of grammar schools, focused on teaching basic reading and writing to boys from merchant and artisan families. While these schools often served as stepping stones to Latin-based education, they sometimes provided a terminal education in practical literacy, equipping students with the skills needed for commerce or local administration. These schools, sometimes supported by civic authorities or guilds, aimed to produce individuals capable of managing accounts, drafting simple letters, and understanding basic legal documents in their local language. This practical education, often overlooked in the grand narrative of university learning, was crucial for the functioning of medieval society. Even within higher learning, some figures recognized the value of the vernacular. While not replacing Latin, some scholars and thinkers began to use vernacular for specific purposes, such as communicating complex ideas to a wider, non-clerical audience. This was a subtle but important acknowledgement of the vernacular's growing intellectual weight. Figures like Dante Alighieri in Italy championed the use of the vernacular for sophisticated literary and philosophical expression, demonstrating its capacity for depth and nuance. His work, The Divine Comedy, written in Tuscan Italian, became a foundational text for the Italian language and showed how a vernacular could carry immense intellectual and artistic weight. The slow rise of vernacular literacy also impacted the way people learned history. Chronicles and historical accounts, traditionally written in Latin, began to appear in local languages. These vernacular histories were often commissioned by noble families or civic authorities, allowing them to record their own lineage, achievements, and local events in a language accessible to their courts and subjects. This helped foster a shared historical consciousness among people who did not have the benefit of a Latin education, creating a different kind of informed populace. This gradual shift was not a sudden revolution, nor did it fully displace Latin within the medieval period. Instead, it was a subtle, persistent evolution that responded to the practical, social, and cultural needs of a changing society. It quietly expanded the definition of literacy and who could participate in the world of written knowledge. This often uncelebrated movement laid crucial groundwork for the massive educational changes that followed in subsequent centuries, making written knowledge incrementally more accessible to the majority, who spoke only their native tongues. It was a foundational, understated reform that began to democratize access to learning, one local word at a time.